Hi, and welcome back to Glassbox, writing automated RSpec tests. In our previous video, we set up our environment so that it was able to cater for writing Ruby and RSpec tests. And we wrote a really basic RSpec test. I really didn't explain in detail anything about it other than we just wrote a test just to prove that everything worked. So today we're going to have a look at writing some really basic classes using Ruby, and then writing a test for those classes using RSpec. And I'm going to assume that you either know very little or rather next to nothing about Ruby, which is probably a good starting point. That way I can assume that this video would probably cater for everyone's need. So let's begin. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a class by right clicking, new, and just creating a Ruby class. Really quickly about the framework. At the moment there's nothing in there. It's quite literally just a source directory in our root project folder. So the class I want to create is called animal. Let me explain what this really quickly is. When we say class followed by a name, this is declaring that this is a class, and everything inside a Ruby class, whether that's methods or loops or functions, whichever way you want to look at it, everything ends with an end. So this is probably the first thing to note about classes. In classes you have variables just like any other OOP language, and yes, Ruby is an object-oriented language. You can have various things, variables, methods, constructors, so on. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a really basic variable. And the variable we're going to create is just, let's just say name. Name is going to equal nil. Nil is almost the equivalent of null. So if you used other languages such as Java or C#, where you define something with a null value, it basically means this object exists but it doesn't have a value which is usable. It instead has a value of null. So in Ruby we say nil. And similarly we can define other variables to use in a class, such as, let's just say age in this case. Again, let's just say nil also. Now, like other languages where when you want to write a constructor, you usually have some kind of accessor modifier, like public for instance, or private, or protected, and so on. In Ruby you usually just jump in by saying def. In other words, def standing for define. And to define a constructor in Ruby you actually use a very specific method name called the initializer, or the initialize method. Like I said, every method or everything inside a class ends with an end. So in this case this would end with an end. So this is effectively a constructor now for the animal class. Just like any other constructors, we can pass in parameters. So we can say something like, let's just say we'll pass in a name value and we'll pass in an age value. So notice we don't actually define what these are. We don't say, for example, this is a string or this is a number or an int. We don't do any of that. We just say what it is that we're going to pass in. Inside our constructor we can then go further and actually pass the values we pass in into our constructor and assign those values to our class variables. So we can say @name is equal to name, and we can do the same thing with the age. So this is quite literally a really basic constructor in which we pass in variables and then assign values to our class variables, if you like. The next thing we're going to do is we're just going to write two methods. We're going to write a setter and a getter method for each one of these really quickly. So again, we're just going to say def to symbolize the beginning of a method, and we're just going to say get name, and this will return name. And we'll do def set name, and we'll pass in a value. We'll call this name, and in here we're going to say name is equal to name, and we'll just quickly copy paste this so that we can reflect the same thing for the age. So here we have a really basic class with a couple of class variables in which we can assign values. We have a constructor, and we have 4 different methods, 2 which allow us to get each one of these variables, and the other 2 which allow us to set each one of these variables. So obviously the focus of this video is on the testing side, so I won't really focus too much on the Ruby side unless if there's a need for it, if there's a ask for it by you, that you want to know a little bit more about how to do this in Ruby or how to do that in Ruby, then yeah, I can go into detail. Otherwise I'm going to try and focus my deliveries more on the RSpecs. Right, so now that we've got our class, what we're going to do effectively is try and write a couple of tests to test this class. And by writing this RSpec test class, this should give you a really good understanding of how to write RSpec tests. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click and just go new, and this time we're going to add an RSpec test template. So the file name we're going to say is, let's just call it animal test, and the behavior is effectively what behavior or what interaction or what service you're trying to test. So in this case, what we're trying to test is our class animal. So I'll just say testing animal class, and the it should is effectively a test inside your test class. So there are obviously various things we can test here. We can test to see if getName returns the correct name after we initialize the object, or if we're able to set a name, can we, when we do a getName afterwards, does it return us the right name? There's various permutations of different tests we can do. So we're just going to pick one, and the one we're going to pick is, let's just say get initialized name. Press OK. So we're just going to get rid of that. So what we want to do is, if I just write in comments, comment form, and to write a comment in Ruby in general is just a hash sign. What we want to do is inside this particular test is create a animal class object and initialize it, pass some variables to the constructor, then get the name value and check that it is correct. So that's effectively the steps we're going to try and do inside our test to check that we are able to test this class by providing in a certain value and getting a certain value out of it as well. So the first thing we're going to do is initialize it. Well, when we initialize it, it's actually quite straightforward. All you do is you provide some kind of object name you want to initialize your class into. So in this case, we're just going to say animal, and animal is going to be equal to, and this is where you provide the name of your class. So the name of our class is animal. This is really important to note. The name of the class doesn't have to be the same as the name of the class file. This could have been called test animal, or this could have been called cat or dog, but the actual class could be called animal. So it's important that you give the class name. So we can say animal.new, and here we can pass in the arguments we want. So the first argument we want to pass in is a name. So we're just going to say, let's say Dino. And the second argument we want to pass in is an age. So let's say 5. And notice that this had a red line under it, but now it doesn't, signifying that it's kind of accepted the values as is. By passing in values, we've pretty much satisfied this second step we wanted to have as well. So we can get rid of that and put that up there if you like. So the second thing we need to do is actually get the name value. So let's just say the name value will be whatever it is. We want to get it. So let's just create a new variable. In this case, let's just say name value, and inside this we're going to assign this particular value by using animal and then calling its method get name. So let's say animal dot get name. What this will do is this will grab this value we provided via the name get method and store that method in this name value. And the last thing we want to do is let's just print this name value out. Now if you want to print something out in Ruby, there are multiple ways. This is probably the most common way. You do a puts. What the puts does is it basically prints out anything you want and also includes a character return at the end of your printed statement. So if you had kind of multiple puts, for instance, if you had this, it would print name value on 2 different lines. If you use other commands such as I think print, then it print the whole thing on a single line. So let's really quickly run this and see what happens. So to run it, just right click, run test animal class. Okay, so we've got an error. Right, so what is the error? It's saying so whenever you get an error in Ruby, it usually points out the error using this this arrow key here. Although it can be misleading, it might mean there might not be an error there. It could be somewhere preceding to that line. But anyway, it's saying it's an error here. So in fact, if you notice, this line has now been slightly highlighted. If we just hover over it, it's saying don't put space before argument parentheses. Ooh. In other words, we're not allowed to put a space between new and the parameters. So okay, we'll just get rid of that and we'll rerun the test. So now again I'm expecting another error. Can anyone here spot what the error could potentially be? Well, I'm expecting an initialization error. So let's run this and see what happens. So what it's basically saying is this constant of animal is not being initialized. What effectively is being asked is that because we're using animal here, this object doesn't actually exist. In other words, the test cannot see the class. So what we need to do is just basically import this class in. And the way we do it is to use a require relative and then provide the name of the class, or sorry, the name of the file, not the name of the class. So if we just say animal, there you go. Now if we run this, it should be fine. So let's run. Okay, so it's run the test and it's run a example. When we have a it method, this it is treated as an example, and I'll give some clarifications as to why. There were 0 failures and there was a total of 1 that passed. If you go at the very end, if you look here and read this statement, what this says is test animal class should get initialized name. So it's effectively taking this description and then the it method and connecting the two up. So at the end you actually get a set of results almost in plain English saying exactly what the test was that ran. So this is actually a benefit. It's a really small advantage that you can get from using RSpec. It's one of the small kind of gifts, if you like, of using RSpec. So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to write another quick test to, let's just say, set the name and then get the name based on the set, based on the value we use for the set method. So I'm just going to quickly copy this, and this time we're going to say should get set name. So in here we're going to say Dino, but then what we will do is we'll call the animal dot set name method, and in here we'll provide a different name. So let's just say Max. So this get name now should return us a value of Max instead. So let's run this again. Right click, run test. So it's run 2 tests. From the first test we got the Dino, nothing's changed. From the second one we got Max, which is what we were expecting. So if you look here, it says it ran 2 examples of which 2 passed. So far we've kind of looked at really basic understanding of how to write a really basic RSpec test with an example of actually writing some kind of class code and then using that class in our test. Now a lot of people might say, why don't you just write a WebDriver test? Why are you almost wasting our time just writing this class and then testing this class? Just jump into WebDriver, man. What's taking so long? Well, the reason I'm not doing that is because when we start looking at our WebDriver test, and we will start looking at our WebDriver test from the next video, you need to understand how to use classes, because you'll eventually want to use page objects. You'll eventually want to write your own utility classes and use that with WebDriver. And doing this gives more understanding than jumping straight into WebDriver and trying to do everything left, right and center. I think it's just it gives a little bit more context to write better tests than to just jump in. On the note of context, the RSpec test, RSpec has another concept which will allow us to better segregate the test up. It can better help us to divide the test up, and this is called the context area. So what the context area does is it allows us to have much more defined areas to write inside a test. So let's just say we've got this test here which handles name. Now let's just say we duplicate that, and here I'll just minimize those just to avoid a little bit of confusion. Here, instead of name, let's start doing age instead. And I'll do the same here as well. And this time we'll set it to say 10. Okay. So now if you run this test, the reason why it returned a 5 is because we're setting the name. We need to set the age to age. So apologies, if I rerun the test, we now get Dino Max, which was expected, and then the age we get a 5 and the 10. The reason we get a 5 from the first one is because we're just getting the value we provided to the constructor. The reason why we get a 10 from the second one is because we're looking for the age after we set it instead. So going back to this context, if you have various tests, say in this case we're testing 2 different tests for name and 2 different tests for age, and we keep on going down that track, you can eventually end up with many tests, and that will make it difficult to track. But if you have this context area where we say something like to test name, for instance, and we move those tests in from there into there, and let's just minimize those tests for the moment, and we make another one for the age, and let's just say to test age, and we move this test in there, and again let's just minimize this really quickly. You can now see that these 2 tests, although still within the same test class, are actually divided into 2 clear and understanding groups. So let's just say we wanted to run all these tests. If we click run test outside of the context, this runs all the tests. But if we run a test inside a context, then this will only run the tests inside that context, and we can test the same thing with the age. So this is a pretty nifty way of being able to run multiple tests from a collection of multiple other tests. This is one of the, if you like, key differences that RSpec provides that not many other testing frameworks provide. For instance, in JUnit, if you opened up a JUnit class and it had, let's just say, 4 or 5 different tests, you either run them all or you run one. Through RSpec, you can run them all or you can run a set. It's pretty convenient. You can even wrap both of these contexts inside another context if you really like. So it's a really cool way of running multiple tests without having to run many other tests, if you like. It's a really basic, primitive form of writing a test suite, if you will. So in this video, we've basically looked at how to write a really basic class for the purpose of preparing us to write, say, page objects or utility classes when we jump onto Webdriver. And the next video will certainly be on writing a Webdriver test. And we've looked at the basic constructs, so the describe block, a context block, and it, and how we write tests in RSpec. So these few things, although probably not a lot, are the basic building blocks to writing RSpec tests, and it's really important that you understand these concepts first before trying to understand anything else. And that's it for this video, folks. If you enjoy my videos and find they bring you some new knowledge or insight into writing Webdriver RSpec tests, then please subscribe and rate. If you have any questions or video suggestions, then please leave a comment below. Many thanks for watching. Until next time, ciao.